Hello and welcome back to All Things Money. I'm your host, David Blain. Thank you for joining us today for this second segment. If you missed the first segment, head on over to the web, www.dlblain.com, and there you'll find archives of the show. We had a great tax case of where taxpayers were denied a $25,000 deduction that they legitimately made to their church. They even had the canceled checks. You can also give us a call on a phone number, 252-633-0107, and we can get you a copy of that case as well. Or you can also email us. Our email is allthingsmoney@dlblain.com. Okay, when we've wrapped up the first segment, we're talking about Mark Zuckerberg and his 1.05% adjustable rate mortgage. During the break, I did look up. It was about $6 million that he borrowed. And when you think about it, the inflation rate of 1.7, the value, the dollars that he owes are losing value faster than his loan is accruing interest. So it's a fabulous deal. It's one of those things that, why wouldn't you do it? If you have the money and rates go up, he can always pay it off. So one of the things that we mentioned for our viewers and listeners out there is if you have the money to pay something off, debt is not such a bad thing. There's a certain person, a radio, TV personality out there that advocates, getting out of all this debt. Sure, consumer debt, paying off that TV that you bought 5 years ago or things like that. But when it comes to borrowing money, especially for real estate, when you can borrow at rates like this. Now, the average adjustable rate right now is 2.69%. But even so, if you are able to deduct some of that interest, your after-tax interest rate may be around 2%, and you have the money to pay it off, and you have something else to do with it, maybe you invest in your business or investing in your education or something that you can do with that money, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, it's a good lesson to learn. There's been a lot of talk recently. In fact, the joke about that loan was, since he got his loan for 1%, was not only is in the 1% versus 99%, but he was able to borrow his money at 1%. But we wanted to talk about some things that you don't necessarily have to be extremely wealthy to take advantage of. While doing some research, I came across this table, some fascinating things. If you ever have a chance to look at some of this stuff or just listen to the show, and we'll tell you, but looking at the history of tax rates from the modern era, the modern the modern income tax was enacted in 1913. There was some income tax in the Civil War, but it was repealed. And in fact, income tax was at one point was ruled unconstitutional in the U.S. So there is hope for those that want to repeal Obamacare that in the future it could be ruled unconstitutional. Anyway, in 1913, the lowest tax bracket was 1%, and it applied to taxable income of $20,000. So there wasn't hardly anybody paid it. The top rate was 7%, and it applied to people making $500,000 or more, which was a very, very minuscule number of people. If you look at inflation-adjusted numbers, it applied to probably, 20 people or something in the U.S. Anyway, that's where the tax rate started at. Lowest rate, 1%. Highest rate, 7%. As we look through the tax rates, we see that the tax rates remain relatively low for the lowest brackets, jumping up to 4% by the time World War II hit. Around World War II, the rates, they did go up quite a bit for the lower people, reaching a peak of 23% on the first $2,000 of income in the peak war years. At the same time, for your upper-end taxpayers, during that same period of time, it reached 94% on incomes over $200,000. I mean, that is just amazing. A few years prior to that, in the 30s, as we were growing out of the Depression, once again, you see a very targeted tax. You saw the highest rates at 79% on people making $5 million or above. And this is my point in this, is that what starts out as a tax to target a few people, the wealthy. Back in 1913, well, 7% if you're making $500,000 or more, sure, go ahead and tax those folks. In the 1930s, 80% of your money, sure, tax that of people making $5 million or more, no problem at all. But what we see is a tax creep. And by the time the peak war years came around, the 94% tax bracket applied to people making $200,000 or more. Now, once again, that was still not what $200,000 is today, but just a few years prior, it was on people making $5 million, and it dropped down to $200,000. So you can see that these tax increases typically at some point ensnare more and more people. Then we see is throughout the 50s, that lowest tax bracket, it stayed higher. That the days of the 1%, 4% on the lowest taxpayers when it was first enacted, pretty much gone forever after World War II. That they stayed at 20% throughout the 1950s, at around 14% the 1960s and 70s. We see also that for years and years in the 70s, ever since World War II, we saw that 94% tax bracket. We see 91, 90, 70%. This is kind of when I was growing up, and I remember this, the highest marginal tax bracket in 1980 was still 70%. So somebody that made, in that year, the limit was $215,000, 70% of everything they made over that went to taxes. Well, we're coming up on our second break here. When we come back, we'll continue talking about some of the tax brackets throughout history and how they have changed. So for All Things Money, I'm your host, David Blain, and we'll return after a few short messages from our sponsors.